Hello, welcome to this opening debate at the Battle of Ideas 2024. Demographic change. Will we run out of workers? I'm Rob Lyons. I'm the convener of the Academy of Ideas Economy Forum, which is partnering on this session. So this is the first discussion in the Strand Battle for the Economy, which runs throughout the day in this room. And the subsequent sessions are Britain Isn't Working, the Rise of Joblessness at 12:15, OBR, Independent Oversight or Anti-Democratic Quango at 1:45, Could AI Break the Productivity Impasse at 2:45, and Running Back to EU, Labour, Europe and the Economy at 4:45. So, on to this session. Earlier this month, the Office for National Statistics announced that the UK's population had grown by about 1% over the past year. But for the first time, there were more deaths than births. The rise in population was entirely due to net migration. Britain's population is getting older. In the most recent census, over 11 million people, that's 18.6% of the total population, were aged 65 or older, compared to just 16.4% at the time of the previous census in 2011. So the question is, who will fill the jobs? Who will create the wealth to pay for all those pensioners? Do we need mass immigration to fill those jobs, or higher productivity, or, well, whatever? We don't know. So that is the sort of terrain on which we'll be discussing this morning. And I have a fine panel of speakers to kick us off, and I'll introduce them in the order they're going to speak. So on my far left is Phil Mullen. He's a writer, lecturer, business manager. He's also author of Beyond Confrontation, Globalists, Nationalists and Their Discontents. By the way, these are very brief introductions. You'll find all about our speakers on the website. Next to speak on the far right, which you won't be comfortable with, is Charlie Winstanley, public and social policy specialist. He's the author of a forthcoming book, Bricking It, on the UK's housing crisis. Third speak is Hilary Salt. She's deputy leader of the SDP. She's an actuary and she's partner at First Actuarial. And last but not least, Dominic Frisby, financial writer, comedian, ukulele-playing comedian. You may have seen his songs go viral on social media. He's the author of Bitcoin, the Future of Money, and the new Letter on Liberty, Why Cash Keeps Us Free, which he'll be discussing in a separate session at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. So, without further ado, Phil, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Presume that's for Rob. Thanks very much, Rob, and good morning, everyone. Economics, the dismal science. Now, that phrase, as some of you know, was first coined by Thomas Carlyle, the 19th century Scottish essayist, in a different context. But he also described the work of another Thomas as being dismal. That was the economist Thomas Malthus, who gloomily predicted that population would always grow faster than food, dooming mankind to unending poverty and hardship. Now, that Malthusian association is what usually registers with regard to economics' dismal reputation. And I'd say it is one that has been well nourished by subsequent demographers and population scholars within the Malthus tradition. For instance, the late 1960s, we had Paul Ehrlich, the author of the best-selling Population Myth, who predicted that high fertility rates would mean that the world's overpopulation would soon outpace food production, and that by 1985, enough people would have starved to death to, quote, reduce the Earth's population to some acceptable level, like 1.5 billion. Now, I think even the youngest of you will know that 1985 was not quite as dismal as that annihilation of the population. And I think today many demographic determinists sustain this dismalness, though remarkably they've done a 180-degree flip, because they're now warning us about the exact opposite: aging, low fertility, and underpopulation. They claim that a deteriorating ratio of working age PT to retirees is causing an unsustainable burden for society, labour shortages, pension crises, higher national indebtedness, as well as flat output per person of productivity. And despite all the failures of the dismal calamities prophesied from previous population projections, today's notions around the idea of running out of workers has unfortunately attained widespread influence. This has at least, I think, three damaging effects, which I'm going to outline. The first is that they reinforce today's what I call status quo miserabilism. Because if you're already anxious about what the future holds and fearful of change, warnings of the disastrous consequences of an inexorably aging and shrinking population will very likely amplify your sense of helpless gloom. And ironically, being terrified about the future has become an anti-natalist argument from some environmentalists who question why bring a child into this dismal world. The second problem is intellectual misdirection. Blaming population change for genuine economic predicaments, not least stagnating productivity, distracts us from getting to grips with their specific drivers and potential fixes. Indeed, demographic hopelessness discourages economic problem solving because it endorses the fatalist outlook that we are stuck with these difficulties, since it's going to take a very long time, if ever, to reverse what they call demographic momentum. The third problem, which aggravates the first two, is that the concern seems so credible. Because surely anything described as aging and diminishing has got to be heading into peril. Surely a falling birth rate must mean that sometime there will not be enough working people to support those who are living longer. This apparent truism is why the favorite metric of anxious demographers is the old age dependency ratio, which measures the rising proportion of over 64-year-olds to the working age population between the ages generally of 16 to 60. Now, there's a technical term for theorizing from this type of statistic. The word is cobblers. The direction of change of this ratio is not in dispute, because while, say, 5 British people of working age were supposedly supporting every elderly person back in 1970, that number has fallen to 3 today and could well decline to 2 in the course of the next half century. Those figures are quite credible. It's the dismal interpretation of them that is flawed. The essential mistake is seeing that a person's economic role as determined primarily by their chronological age, rather than by what they do, whether they're working or not, how productive they are, if they are not in work, are they living off their own resources, or are they living off state welfare? In reality, the people placed in either of the age ratios, numerator or denominator, are not as distinct as presumed in their levels of financial independence or dependence. Moreover, there's more variance within age groups than between them. Consider who is the biggest dependent of these two. A 70-year-old taking her full state pension of about $11,500, or a 35-year-old public sector worker. Both are paid from the same tax revenues. And if earning the median salary of 36 grand, the public sector worker is actually 3 times more dependent on the country's wealth producers than that dependent pensioner. Furthermore, the highlighting of age-related dependency ignores that there are nearly double the number of people who are not in employment below the age of 65 than those above it. One more bit. And as secondary, there are also highly consequential error, which is intrinsic to age dependency ratios, is that by comparing 2 discrete groups, it overlooks that everyone's society, working or non-working, old or young, is actually dependent on the wealth that it's produced. Now, adjusting for these false age-based assumptions, we can instead generate an economic dependency ratio that compares the whole population as dependent on the nation's wealth to the producers, let's say people in work. And winding forward to the end of this century, while the old age dependency ratio dismally suggests a 3/4 worsening, an impossible burden for society, the economic dependency ratio could be pretty much flat. No change. To conclude, by fixating on people's age group, the first perspective incites anxiety, it adds to debilitating fatalism, and by pitching one generation against another, it's divisive, and alienates us from each other. The other, more production-based perspective diffuses, I think, the idea of a demographic time bomb, and it allows us to focus together on the common crucial task of improving how people are living and working, and by raising productivity and the quality of our jobs.
Okay, thank you very much, Phil. Charlie.
Thanks. So, according to the Learning and Works Institute, funded by the Local Government Association, the UK is anticipated to suffer a shortfall of 2.5 million high-skilled workers by 2030. This figure includes a shortage of around 750,000 workers in the health system, 200,000 in hospitality and retail, 400,000 in construction, another 400,000 in tech and digital, 100,000 HGV drivers, 175,000 manufacturing workers, and 70,000 teachers. So the issue of what's caused this is an expansive topic, obviously, that Phil's just given us an introduction on some of that, and we don't have masses time to go through all of it in the introduction. I think that it would be a mistake to say that ageing plays no role. I mean, we're looking at losing between 2.2 to 2.7 million workers over the course of the decade from ageing, and another 1.7 million workers rendered economically inactive due to caring responsibilities. There's other issues such as early retirement and broader economic activity, which Phil has rightly called out, mentioned here, and the expansion of years spent in education and increase in chronic health conditions are all playing a role. But conversely, according to the same study which estimates 2.5 million shortage of highly skilled workers by 2030, the UK will also, by the same point, have an oversupply of 3.1 million intermediate and low-skilled workers. So with this in mind, I wanted to focus on one major area of policy which I believe the UK currently performs very poorly on, which is workforce planning. The UK's underperformance of workforce planning is interesting, not least given how well we did on it in the past. So in the post-war era, workforce planning was integrated in lots of other areas of strategic social public policy, proactive long-term industrial planning, national house building, new towns programme. During this time, government worked closely with employers, particularly in newly nationalised industries and strategic sectors of the private sector, such as manufacturing and construction, ensuring that labour supply matched need. The workforce planning was held together by a really well-established vocational apprenticeship system, particularly in industries like engineering and construction. And what we see is throughout the period from 1950 to 1973, unemployment in the UK never exceeded 2%, whilst after the immediate workforce crisis of the Second World War, we never experienced a huge crunch in the workforce supply either. The UK system of workforce planning really started to come apart during the economic shocks of the 70s, particularly with the collapse of the textile sector, but was massively accelerated during the Thatcher government with the privatisation of a lot of the nationalised industries and the collapsing of those established relationships, strategic relationships around workforce planning that existed within them. And then further through the deindustrialisation process, which also destroyed the traditional apprenticeship system in this country. The rise of the services sector as an alternative to these sectors was also a sector where long-term workforce planning was never really integrated into the business model, and vocational training was often unnecessary. The marketisation of higher education has also played a role, where the provision of degrees dictated by student demand has ultimately disadvantaged STEM subjects at the expense of humanities and other subjects. I mean, it has really occurred out of kilter with the labour market. These trends have seen vocational training reduce in status relative to academic qualifications, which has further weakened the supply of labour into crucial sectors such as construction, manufacturing and engineering. Additionally, the UK today has a tremendously developed system of outsourcing, with UK companies structured without vertical integration, often as a series of interconnected contractors and subcontractors, usually providing very specific elements of an overall service on a short-term basis. This model produces organisations with little strategic perspective on questions such as future supply of labour, and particularly in construction, it contrasts with the far more vertically integrated examples of best practice and workforce planning from elsewhere around the world. In this context, both UK public and private sectors in the UK have increasingly lent on inward migration to fill gaps. So we're now in the strange position that with more students in further and higher education than ever before, we have a gigantic and growing mismatch between workforce supply and demand. In a healthcare system, we cap the numbers of university places for doctors and nurses well below the level of demand for those courses every year, creating an undersupply of staff, which then costs the system an estimated £10 billion a year to fulfil through temporary employment. In sectors which are widely considered crucial to our economic and productivity growth, government is not working strategically and collaboratively with employers to identify long-term skills and workforce requirements, ensure adequate and properly incentivised training places to fill them. But this is bigger than just training provision. Ultimately, resting in this, there have to be some societal value judgment as to where resources should be placed. So during the neoliberal years of the Thatcher government, the phrase picking winners was derogatively used to describe the process of pre-war economic planning, for which the state would work strategically to protect and expand key industries and services which provided important functions for employment, national defence and economic resilience. It seems to me that picking winners is actually a very sensible policy given the needs of our society today, and in the context of the UK being gazumped by international rivals like the China and USA, who are far less concerned about creating dirigisms from the strategic sectors. So we need to be picking winners. And in relation to this, I think we also need to be thinking about how our economy is incentivising the roles where we are struggling to recruit enough staff. How can it be the case that given the huge demands on the care sector in the context of our ageing population, for example, wages here are amongst the lowest of any sector, often paid below minimum wage? And it's also how about how we're structuring our businesses. So the British culture of outsourcing is primarily a byproduct of the UK's developed and grown commercial services economy. We don't merely outsource ourselves, we also export outsourcing as a service via an array of intermediary commercial products in the ineffable ephemera of the modern digital knowledge economy. These jobs are in themselves often well paid, but I feel there's a question to be asked as to whether in the context of severe skill workforce shortages in construction, engineering, logistics and health, does it make sense for us as a society to have such a large pool of educated and capable individuals working in fields like marketing, sales and, ironically, recruitment, which itself is a byproduct of a lack of adequate workforce planning? Other countries haven't taken the same path, with many, such as Germany and Japan, deliberately maintaining a balanced workforce allocation across industrial sectors as well as services. You don't have to do this. The bigger picture is this. To answer the demographic problem in the jobs market today, we'll almost certainly need some migration. We should ideally plug part of the gap with investment in productivity gains, as Phil was alluding to. And there's a big question here about our system of training. But much wider than that, we really need to get to grips with the fundamental purpose of our economy, which is to provide wealth, goods and services, which we all need to have a prosperous and happy life. This means exerting our democratic collective ideals to decide what jobs we want and where we need people to work. Thank you all.
Very interesting you talk about that, because when I went back to uni in the late 1990s to learn computer programming, not only did I get my fees paid, but I got a grant as well. And I've not heard about that going on since, which seems remarkable. Anyway, Hilary.
Great, thank you. So, forgive me, but I wanted to start kind of with my actuarial hat on by explaining some of the complexities of measuring populations, and in particular of measuring fertility. Because judging by some of the kind of screaming headlines, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the data. So there's two ways you can measure fertility. The first way is to measure it using what we call a cohort approach. So using that approach, you have to wait until a woman has reached the end of her childbearing years. That in itself is a tricky concept. And you say, looking backwards, how many children have women on average had? Now, that's a very reliable way of measuring fertility, but it is very delayed. You know, you can't measure it until in the past. So, you know, now we can measure the cohort fertility of women born in the late 1970s. And if we do that, if we use that cohort approach, we can see that women born in 1977 have a completed family size of 1.94 children in the UK, compared to their mother's generation of 2.07 children. And a high, at least for generations alive today, of 2.42 for women born in 1933. So, you know, in terms of recent changes, actually not that big a change. But much more striking is the difference in the number of children women had before they were 30. So for the 1977 cohort, they had fewer than 1.98. And for their mothers, it was 1.54. So there's definitely a shift to later maternity. Of that 1977 cohort, only 16% had no children compared to 14% of their mothers. So again, not a massive shift to childlessness. And two children families do remain the norm. So 38% of the 1977 cohort compared to 44% of their mothers. So that cohort way of measuring fertility is one approach. The other approach, which is the numbers that tend to be mentioned in the press much more often, is what we call the period fertility rate, period total fertility rate. Now, what that does is it applies recent rates of live births to the current structure of the female population to work out a hypothetical average number of children for today's women. Now, that is fine, in terms of a way to do things, but it can be quite misleading if there's a change in the age at which women have children, which we have seen that. So that means apply previous age-specific rates to today's female populations can give you something that is not very helpful. But that's the basis on which many of the numbers that people bandy around today are done. So period total fertility rate in 2022 was 1.46 children per woman, a significant fall from 1.94 as recently as 2010. So that does point to a fall in the expected number of births, but I just caution with the fact that we don't really know until today's younger women reach the end of their childbearing years, what exactly that change is. So there's a need for care with the statistics. Well, that really hasn't stopped a kind of apocalyptic discussion about the collapse in fertility. Quite interestingly, if you look at a map showing fertility rates by region, there's a really big difference between the kind of somewhere areas and the kind of anywhere Twitterati regions. A really big difference in the fertility levels between those. So should we be panicking? And my view is we shouldn't panic, but we should care. So it's important to know that the relationship between the economy and the structure of the population is complex. Phil's already mentioned that in terms of, lots of other drivers. David Bloom, the Harvard demographer and economist, noted, "It's an overstatement to say that demography determines all, because it downplays that both demographic trajectories and their developmental implications are responsive to economic incentives, to policy and institutional reforms, and to changes in technology, cultural norms and behaviour." But that complexity is often drowned out in popular discussion by what we might call demographic thinking, which, as Phil's noted, is really characterised by a tendency to fatalism. And I think you can tell that a lot of those approaches are kind of a priori thinking, because at different times they claim the exact opposite. So with a rising population, the kind of doomographers say more people, limited resources, things are going to get worse. With falling fertility, they say fewer people, less growth, things are going to get worse. So, there's the fact that they draw exactly opposite conclusions from the same things tells you something. But I think there is a really visceral worry about falling fertility. If you go back to Walter Bagehot claiming in 1872 that the most successful races, other things being equal, are those which multiply the fastest. Quite an interesting concept these days. In reality, there are much more important drivers to the growth of the economy, participation in the workforce. We do have a real issue here with people being unwilling or unable to contribute. The quality of our infrastructure, levels of business efficiency and productivity, and those are all things that we can actually tackle more easily than fertility. The other reason I want to push back against the panic is because I do think it provides a pretext for intervention into people's lives, and in particular into women's lives. We've seen in the past how policies to address what was then seen as too many births were pushed forward by intervention in women's lives. Phil's already mentioned Paul Ehrlich of the population bomb. He said, women have traditionally only been allowed to fulfil the roles of wife and mother. Anything that can be done to diminish the emphasis on those roles and provide women with equal opportunities in education, employment and other areas is likely to reduce the birth rate. My fear is that it's exactly the opposite kind of things are being talked about. I'm absolutely happy to see financial help for those choosing to have children, but I worry about things like Macron's health checks for women and what seems like a really concerted attempt to normalise things like surrogacy, the renting out of women's bodies for reproduction. So for all those reasons, I want to argue against panic, but at the same time, I think we have to recognise that many young people actually do want to have families, but they're hampered by inadequate, unaffordable housing, a taxation system that provides no help to parents, exorbitant childcare costs, and a general social attitude that the world isn't fit for their children. So we need to support that generation in forming families by building houses, providing the financial and human support they need to allow them to really share in that fulfilment that parenthood brings, to give them a real investment in the future.
Thank you very much. Dominic.
So, good morning, everybody. I wrote a book in 2011 called Life After the State. And the core argument of that book was that we should have much, much less state in our lives. Less state planning, less state intervention, smaller government, and all the rest of it. Most problems will be fixed by the aggregation of individual decisions taken in the marketplace, in real love. And I think just listening to these arguments, partly this morning, but partly more generally, we see a good example of the state cannot even agree on what it wants. Does it want more people? Does it want less people? Does it want more migration? Does it want less? It can't even agree on what it wants. So until it can agree on what it actually wants, how can it plan for it? And that's why the whole planning situation is such a complete mess. But anyway, I write a great deal about migration and demographics on my Substack, The Flying Frisbee, and it's because of that that Rob asked me to come and speak today. And so there are two sets of numbers I want to give you about migration and demographics more generally. And the first is this: we have a very insular view. We look at everything from the point of view of the UK. And I think we need to take a global look at migration and understand what is going on and what is inevitably going to happen. Okay, so we have 8.2 billion people in the world today. I'm going to give you quite a few numbers, but I'll try and keep them simple. 8.2 billion people. Of that 8.2 billion people, 7 billion live on less than $40 a day. Okay, and 4.6 billion live on less than $10 a day. Most of the wealth of the world, not all, but most of the wealth of the world, or an enormously large chunk of it, lies in Western Europe and in North America. The population of Western Europe is 270 million. That's Western Europe, not all of Europe. And US is 350 million. We are tiny in comparison to those bigger numbers, 7 billion and under $46 a day. Okay. For example, more people are born in Nigeria each day than in the whole of Europe. So that should give you an idea of just the huge imbalance that is going on. Okay. In addition, most people around the world have some English. And so the natural place to go to is where you have a little bit of the language. So that makes the UK, Ireland, and North America very attractive destinations. On top of that, we have the most brilliant transportation we have ever had in all of history. Boats can go quicker, planes can go further, cars can go further, you name it, thanks to fossil fuels and all the rest of it. It is almost possible to go around the world in 24 hours, let alone 72 days or whatever the thing is. More people than ever, better transport than ever. Third factor, we now have, and these numbers are a year out of date, so the number will be higher. More than 85% of the global population now has a smartphone with internet access. Okay, so that smartphone has made people aware of other lives to be had, and it has made people aware of how to get that other life. And in addition, because so much social media is designed around creating envy and FOMO, it has created this enormous global desire for a better life. And in fact, that desire is intrinsic to us all anyway. We all want a better life for ourselves and our children. But it is also show people how to get a better life. So you have these three factors: huge amount of people, better transport than ever, more awareness than ever, and a fourth one, more desire than ever. So it is inevitable. We're already living in a time of global population movement that is unprecedented in all of history. It is only going to increase. That is inevitable. And but which state planner who actually has in a position to actually set policy is talking about that? Because if they are, I'm not aware of it. Because that fundamental global situation should be inherent to how you want to set migration and what your migration policy should be. Okay, so that is thought number one, and I see we're at 5 minutes. And there are more numbers in thought number two, and I shall try and rattle through it as quickly as possible. This second subject is about demographic change in this country. Ben, if I go over a little minute, just bear with me and I'll speak less in the talk. It's very difficult to get accurate numbers about what the demography of this country is from censuses, because a lot of people don't fill them in. A lot of people, who aren't familiar with the census process look at it and they think, if they're here illegally, for example, they might not be honest. Actual migration numbers are very hard to get because so many people come and leave. Where you can get extremely accurate numbers is in the demographics of primary schools. These are accurate numbers. And what the demographics of primary schools are will be the demographics of the country within a generation. Okay. Now, currently, in primary schools, white British is at 61%. And what the DOE calls minority ethnic is 37%, and there's like 2% that's unclassified. Minority ethnic means Asian, 13.5%, white not British, 7.8%, black 6.5%, mixed 7%, and other, whatever that is, 2.4%. Now, bear in mind that these numbers are for the whole of the UK. So that includes remote rural areas where the demographics of primary schools are likely to be 95% plus white British. Where I am in the borough of Lewisham, white British makes up a much lower percentage of primary schools. In some classrooms, probably less than 10%. Now, this 61 to 37 ratio compares, and just 4 years ago, it was 65%. Every year, it's coming down by 1%. A little bit more than 1% every year. In 2006, it was 80-20. And in 2002, it was 85-15. So that's an increase of about 85% minority ethnic in 15 years, or 2.5 times in 20 years. Now, that means that on the current trajectory, less than a decade from now, white British will be a minority in primary schools. And I think, I don't want to get into the whole race argument. I just think that is a very profound thought. And, of course, what is the case in primary schools will be the case in the country within a generation after that. Of course, white British long since been a minority in London, and it's a minority in Birmingham, and other cities are following suit. Sorry?
Are you done?
I was going to wrap up with a great climactic conclusion.
Oh, right, but 30 seconds. Go on.
Okay, thank you very much. So those are the two trends that I wanted to describe. And there's a lot more arguments about why people are having smaller families and what goes on in Japan and aging populations that I'm sure we'll come to in a second. But I think those are two very important trends to have in our mind, and they are two trends that are not being discussed at the planning level. Thank you.